Good afternoon. We are the Pan Valley Institute Artivism Fellowship. I am Joshua Slack. I am the Artivism Fellow, and I am joined by our intern Shane as well as Minerva. And we are here to deliver this Platica known as the Colors of Migration. And we are missing two of our other interns, Natalie and Chinu. They were not able to make it because they are ill. However, we will still be moving on with the program as intended, but we will not have anybody to cover the Hmong experience. So to start off, I was just going to read a brief introduction about what it is that we are doing. The history of the United States has always been shaped by peoples and communities who came into its shores or moved within its borders. Some sought a better life, some fled oppression, and some were moved against their will. These people of vast descendants include Black and African, Chinese, Japanese, Mexican, Native American, Puerto Rican, and Cuban, and just to name a few. And so without further ado, we're going to get started with our discussion, starting with Shane.
Oh yes, thank you for the introduction. Thank you for that. So I would like to introduce myself in my tribal language, and it goes Kuha Tesha Ha'at Suahyatsi Kambakiha Shane, which means hello friends, good morning, my name is Shane. So when talking about displacements of my tribe specifically, we first need to understand what the Natchitoches people are. So the Natchitoches people are consisted of 25 Caddo-speaking nations. So we all speak a dialect of the Caddo language. A lot of these tribes ranged from East Texas into Louisiana and Arkansas as well. And so we've existed for thousands and thousands of years. Our history can be traced back to 800 AD, but of course, the time goes back much, much, much further in our history that isn't recorded. And so for my tribe, we were semi-sedentary. We were like farming community, but we also tended to move around, traded with other tribes as well. And so this really began to change when we first had contact with the French in the early 1700s. And now my tribe wasn't necessarily hostile to these nations, but we mostly were trading and we were intermingling as well. However, this all began to change when Louisiana was sold and Louisiana purchased to the United States of America. And so during that time period, the United States did not honor any of the treaties previous tribes had signed with other European powers. And so as the 1800s start to come around, we start seeing a lot of tribes being moved in the name of manifest destiny, my tribe being one of the people directly affected. So along with American Indian removal, the Trail of Tears, and among a ton of other removals, my tribe did not want to leave their ancestral land. And so it was very difficult decision as many tribes got moved to Oklahoma. And so because my tribe did not want to leave, they decided to stay in Louisiana and hide in plain sight. However, this was very difficult for my tribe because since we were hiding in plain sight, we couldn't practice our cultural beliefs. We didn't have any sacred, safe spaces in order to maintain that. So over time, when we're trying to blend in with society and trying to preserve who we are, we're losing a lot of our language and we're losing a lot of beliefs as time goes on. So that is why today, only a few people can speak the Caddo language, which only two can right now. So we are critically endangered, and we are trying to go through a revitalization process with that. And so finally, as the 1900s roll around, there's a lot of family that's starting to leave Louisiana. They want to get away from the racism and all of the violence that's going on with Native people at the time. And so by the 1930s, my second great-grandmother and my first great-grandmother, Andrea, they decided to leave Louisiana, and they settled in Texas for a little bit of time before moving to California. And my great-grandmother, Andrea, had 10 children, all those being my aunts and uncles. And so what happened to me, though, was because of this displacement and because we were moving so much, I didn't really get a chance to grow up with my culture. And what happened is I was a kid growing up, and I mostly heard a lot of my aunts and uncles speak Spanish, so I always assumed I was Hispanic, or I was I had people in Mexico or something along those lines. But when I would talk about it, they would always say, "Oh no, we're indigenous," or "We're from Louisiana," and I always wondered what was in Louisiana, what was going on there. So it was something that I never really questioned until I got older. And when I started questioning, I asked one of my aunts, and I'm like, "What's in Louisiana?" And she goes, "Oh, we're Native American people." And it was confusing because I was like, well, Native, I've never heard anybody talk about that. And she's like, my grandmother was born in Louisiana, and that's where she is. And so what I ended up doing is I did further research, and I found out that they had a Facebook page. And so when I was going through all of this, I didn't really know how to introduce myself because there was this culture that was lost. I didn't speak the language. I didn't know anything. So when I finally got in contact with them, I sent them a video of me rapping during Indigenous Peoples Day as I started trying to get involved with the community just to figure out where I fit in the grand scheme of things. And when I did that, a lot of people started like messaging me, and they started like just giving me like a lot of positive feedback and like welcoming me home. And they asked me where I was from, and I told them my grandmother's name, and they ended up doing a DNA research test, and they found out that I was related to a majority of people, including the vice chief of our tribe. So it was like a big moment for me in reconnecting, and I'm telling this story mainly because the question that popped in my mind so frequently is like, why did this happen? How come I couldn't grow up in my culture? It's like, why was that like robbed and taken from me? And I started speaking to a lot of people in the tribe, and a lot of people had a very similar experience to me where they were only vaguely aware. And it's because of the violence against indigenous people, the violation of treaties, and just like the genocide that was occurring at that time. It was dangerous to be known as Native. And so a lot of people tried to be anything else other than Native American. I talked with a cousin whose family actually left to New York City. She married an Irishman, and she never wanted to return to her culture because there were people getting killed up to that point. And it was happening like very frequently. So by the time the next generation came along, they didn't really see it as a importance to continue to teach the culture. So over time, it was lost. And so I learned that when my family came to California, they wanted to like not be Native, so they had to blend in, and they couldn't pass for white because they were darker skinned. So they fell in with the Mexican community in Tulare in the Visalia area, and that's when they learned to speak Spanish. And I asked my dad, I'm like, well, why didn't your grandfather or your dad ever talk about being indigenous? And he just simply said, he's like, that's what he was told to label as, to be Mexican, to be Hispanic. And so because of the colonization and because of the displacement that was happening, that nearly eradicated a whole like part of the culture. And so for me, reconnecting at 20 years old and me only being 25 now, it's still a journey, and there's still a lot of difficulty that happens in present time, especially because like my tribe is also only state recognized by Louisiana. So in order to have like those spaces, you need to be federally recognized, and federal recognition can take 20 to 30 years. It's a very long process, and we barely got state recognized in 2017. So because of that, it's like we're running through donations in our own tribe, and we're trying to create those spaces so people can continue. And the big thing is like, that's why we always talk about land back as well, because in land back means of like having those sacred spaces. For example, with the Lakota, with the Black Hills, they need those like religious like places because that's what keeps us connected to culture. So when my tribe was so displaced and forced to hide, we lost that sense of space, and we lost those spaces to continue practicing culture and continuing like to learn the language as well. And so it's like we are barely picking up the pieces. And I think it's important to know the history, and it's important that we do care about the history because we need to learn how we treated other people in the past so we may never repeat those same mistakes anymore. And what I hope for the future of Indigenous people is that we get more recognition as well. And it's important that we do have people reconnecting, because if we don't, then it's like we don't have people continuing the tradition. It is always the Native belief that the elders pass knowledge down to the young, and we pass it down so the next 7 generations can be protected and they can be blessed in their success as well. So definitely like a lot of history there, and it's like our future is still like very uncertain, especially even with tribes that are federally recognized too. It's like we don't really have a lot of sovereignty. If a non-Native commits a crime on the reservation, then they have no power to stop this person whatsoever. It's like they have to leave it in the hands of the federal government. So basically, for me, without my traditional culture and without my tribe, I wouldn't really like be here today, because when you grow up without a sense of identity, it's like you're just trying to figure out where you are in this world. And it's like been very difficult in the sense that like, where do you belong to? Where does your culture come from? And I really didn't have anything that I wanted to believe in whatsoever before I connected. So when I connected to my tribe, it's like it finally gave me a purpose like within my life, and I got to know a lot of the tribes like around here and a lot of like the beliefs, and it's motivated a lot of my work as a spoken word artist and as a poet as well. So, yes, thank you all for listening, and I would like to pass it to Minerva.
Thank you, Shane. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Minerva Mendoza. I am the program coordinator at Pan Valley Institute, but I am also a Mixteca woman from the indigenous communities in the southern state of Oaxaca. Um, and I wanted to put a disclaimer out there that, like I'm also like Shane, in the journey of connecting and learning even about the history of migration of my own family. So there might be some gaps in my story, but like I said, I'm still in that journey of like even learning about my own family's migration journey. And so when I talked to my mom about her childhood, many of the things that she shares with me are very similar to my childhood, in the sense that her father, my grandfather, started his migration journey to the United States in 1961, in January 1961, when he asked a person from a hometown to write him a letter of recommendation, which I imagine it was part of the package to apply to the Bracero program. And in that letter, which I have a copy of because, like I said, I'm in process of reconnecting to. And in that letter, they state his age, that he, works the land, that he is a good citizen of good character. And so my grandfather would be accepted to be part of this Bracero program. And, for just a little bit of background, the Bracero program was implemented from 1961 to 1964. And it was a program in which the United States had a guest program, and they would bring millions of workers, specifically men from Mexico, young men. And so I don't know my grandfather's age, but he was, in the picture, he looks really young. And so the story that my mom tells is that from what she recalls, he would send letters to my grandmother, and she remembers that my grandmother didn't know how to read or write. So she would take it to that one person in the town who knew how to read and write, and would read it to her. And I have a couple of those letters that, again, in my journey of trying to get my family history together, this is a copy of the letter. I didn't bring the actual letter, but I have a couple of the letters, and I'm myself trying to understand because they're so old and they weren't saved in a proper way. So it's hard to read, but from what I gather in those letters, he tells her that he made it fine to California. He was, one of the letters specifically says that he was writing her from Gilroy. And, asks how the kids are. He says that he's sending money, so, to make sure that she is paying debt. And he writes into her in a very respectful way, which I find really amazing. And it makes me have like good memories of him, although I never met him. And so it seems like my grandfather, like I said, worked in the fields here in California. And also that he actually applied for the Bracero program twice. There is a letter, like I said, of recommendation of 1961, and then there's a second letter of 1964. He unfortunately died at a young age. My mom doesn't recall exactly how old he was, but she was, she says, around 7 or 8 years old. And the stories that I did get to hear from my grandmother was that it was a mysterious death, like he kind of just never woke up one time. And she really, I don't know if blame is the word, but she really thought that it was connected to the work conditions that he went through while being in the United States. And she said, I'm sure it was something related to that. Like I said, we never really got to find out, but that was how our story of migration started. Then my dad and mom, also as children, they would migrate to the northern states within Mexico, right? They would go to Baja California, La Paz, Guerrero, and also to do agricultural work. She also has, a lot of memories of working through the fields there. And one of my brothers was actually born in Guerrero Negro, and she said she will take him to the fields to work. And she recalls airplanes flying over them and with pesticides, but they didn't know what that was. And I'm sure that that was not like only my family. There were other families from within our hometown who would come to work. And there is actually right now a large community living there currently who made the state of Baja California their second home. And my family actually went back to our hometown in Oaxaca. And my mom says that the rumors within our town started circulating that this particular person was coming to El Norte, which, is the United States, they refer to the north, and that he was working here, and that they needed a lot of people, to work the agriculture lands in California. And so that's how my father started coming and migrating here. And this is where our childhoods kind of are similar, like as I shared when I started, in the sense that that's my memory of my dad. He would visit us, and I think he would come like twice a year here, and then he would go back. Whenever the season of picking up grapes was done, he would go back. And so then he would come back early spring for the season here. And so my memories of him is also like, not having him often, and, calling. These times he wouldn't send letters, but he would call again to that one phone that we had in our town. And they would make an announcement, and my mom would, take us with her to talk to him. And whenever he did come home, it would be just for a few months, and he would take off again. I didn't know, but in that time that he was here, the first and only immigration reform took place, known as the Immigration Reform and Controls Act of 1986. And basically, because he had already had a history of working here in the United States, but he was also here in California, he could apply for this program. And what he tells me is that he had to, prove that he had been working in the agricultural industry. And my dad has been always good at saving documents. He'll have, paycheck stuff from like when he started working probably. And so he was able to show that he had been here constantly. He had, I think, one of the ranchers he was working for write him a letter also. And he went through that process. And so it is through that process that eventually, as a resident, he was able to petition his family. And so years later, in 2001, my family and I would come with a green card because of the Immigration Reform Act. Unfortunately, one of my brothers, the oldest one, when he petitioned us as family, he was already over the age of 18. And so what that meant is that he was no longer able to get his green card as we all did. He would have to wait what became 20 plus years in order for him to start the process of getting his green card. So he got his green card maybe 2 years ago. And that for me was almost 25 years. So 25 years it took him to become a resident, only because he was 19 years old when my dad petitioned us. And so since I asked my dad, why is it that, why is it that you brought us? Because I was supposed to come into the United States. I was really happy in my hometown. And part of it, he said, it was like he was, he didn't want that family separation any longer. It was becoming exhausting of like going the back and forth. And I asked why Madeira, like why of all places. I love Madeira, by the way. But I asked like why Madeira, and the reason he says is because back in our hometown, he worked the fields. Like he was, a man that worked the land and had, animals and chickens and all of that. And he felt like the California Central Valley land was very familiar to that. That was work that he was able to do. And eventually, that rumor that I shared earlier got around. And so many of our hometown, the people from our hometown actually migrated also. And so in Madeira, you'll find a large population from our hometown, which is Santa Maria Tintu, by the way. And so that's kind of my migration history. And like I said, I still have gaps to fill in terms of how, because my mom tells me that my grandfather, there were more letters that I need to, get a hold of and try to figure out what they say, and hopefully I get a better idea of where he migrated even within California, because that one letter that I have that it says that he's in Hillroy is actually from a P.O. box. And so I hope to find an actual address and actually go visit that place. And yeah, that's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you both. I'm a little boring, I think. First I'll start with more of like a overview of history when it comes down to the Great Migration, which was the migration of African Americans that were descendants of slaves or born into slavery, migrating to the north for better opportunities and living conditions, and then going over how that my family and my history comes into play with that. And so the Great Migration was a massive relocation of African Americans from the rural southern states to the cities in the north, and it came in two waves. So the first wave was from 1910 to 1930, which was about 1.6 million people that had migrated from the south to the north. And it slowed down a little bit because around that time, of course, was the Great Depression. So work jobs and everything were starting to slow down, so there wasn't much of a reason to continue to go up north for any better working opportunity. And then the second wave happened during 1940 to 1970, which was an increase to 5 million people that went ahead and migrated from the south to the north. And that happened in conjunction to the Second World War. So that was also a lot better chances for military recruitment, once the World War II started to happen. Of course, there was more of an industrial complex and having better jobs in order to provide for the military, provide for the war. So a lot of African Americans sought those jobs because a majority of the white Americans were going out to war. So there was a vacancy for those kinds of jobs, and African Americans went ahead and to go ahead and take those. And so they came, of course, from states like Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and they ended up migrating to bigger cities and states known like New York, St. Louis, Detroit, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Indianapolis, and these are all places that to this day have very large black populations in the United States. And so in 1900, about 90% of African Americans in the United States were in the South. And so that number, of course, decreased with the Great Migration. And so when we go to 1863, when they, of course, had the Emancipation Proclamation, and that's when it was signed for the Southern slaves to be free, it, of course, took a very long time for, one, a lot of people to go ahead and follow that proclamation, and two, for those that were born into slavery to even know what freedom would be outside of that lifestyle. And so as they were getting free, those that were slaves and got free during the Emancipation Proclamation decided that they wanted to go ahead and fight for the Union during the Civil War. And the Union Army didn't really know what to do with the slaves, so they could barely afford to have their own troops. And so a lot of those that went to the Union for the Civil War ended up dying because of all the diseases that came with coming from the South all the way up to the North. Though that they were accepted into the Army, into the Union, they didn't, it didn't contribute too much to the population growth at that time. And it's also funny that around this time, after the Emancipation Proclamation, slaves were then called freedmen. And that is now a common last name for between a lot of African Americans, known as freemen. So if you meet any African Americans with the last name Freeman, that's the origin of the last name, which is a fun little tidbit for those who did not know. And so many of them, many African Americans took to the roads to search for work. Sometimes they were traveling over mountains with little more than their clothes, but a lot of them remained in the South. And you can still see this to this day, that though there are large populations of Black Americans in those cities I mentioned, like Philadelphia, New York, and Detroit, in the South is where you're going to see majority of our population still to this day residing in, specifically in those cities, in those states of Alabama, Louisiana, Georgia, Mississippi. And so the Southern economy was in ruins, and many of the freed Blacks, they ended up returning to the plantations shortly after slavery to become sharecroppers. And this is when we have this conversation about slavery being called a different name, because sharecropping was pretty much the exact same conditions of what slavery was during that time. And so the only reason why they decided to do that was in order to keep their family members all together. And that's actually part of my dad's side of the family's history, because as soon as slavery was ended, I don't know how many greats, I want to say 4. I want to say my great-great-great-great-grandmother. She was a slave that was used for breeding children. And she had 3 different children, 3 different white men. Well, one was a white man's baby, and 2 were other slaves, but they were used for different benefits. But the moment that slavery was ended, she went to every plantation she could and got her children back. And which was very admirable and very scary, especially because it was during, this was in Louisiana, which was a very heavy slave import as far as location-wise and the economics of slavery as a business. Louisiana was probably the biggest in the business, especially with interest from the French and all different kinds of things. And so with her going around to different plantations during that time, when there still was, of course, apprehension and a refusal to even tell slaves that they were free, was still something that was incredible. And because of that, we have different branches of last names from our family that go from Wilson to Burrell to, I cannot remember the other one. So our family kind of breaks off into many different ways, and so that's why I have many different cousins, second cousins, all of that nature because of that. And the conditions of sharecropping, like I said, were very similar to slavery, and that lasted for about another 50 years of American history, that the sharecropping and the industrial complex of that was still going on. And because of that, there was, and the understanding that slaves were now free, that Black Americans were now free, there was a lot more of incentive to rebellion. And so another part of my dad's side of the family, so this is where that would be my dad's side with his mother's side coming in that I mentioned earlier, from his dad's side, which is the Slack side, Joshua Slack. On the sharecropping plantation, there was my great grandfather. I'm trying to make sure I get all these greats down. And he and his they weren't married, but the woman that he was with that was pregnant at the time, and she was getting abused on the sharecropping plantation. Very harsh conditions, even for the women. There was no real difference between men and women as far as the workload was seen when it came down to Black Americans in those conditions. And he had enough of it. He got a gun and shot the sharecropper. And during that time, that was, of course, a dangerous thing to do, and he fled and went to Chicago. And Chicago is another area where there's a lot more of free Black Americans. That was where a lot of different things were happening. But because of that, the descendants of my dad's side of the family come from Louisiana and stay there. But when he went to Chicago, he had a completely new life, everything. And there was another branch of Slacks that are from Chicago that I would be now related to. Have no idea who they are, but that kind of is a way of demonstrating just how the family dynamics in the African American community work. And it's not that we call each other family and cousin because just the fictive kin aspect, which is very true because we had to do a lot of found family, but because our family ties are so interlinked and our experiences are so interlinked that we might as well be family at the same time. So that's just a little fun tidbit of that. And let's see, and during this time, this was known as Reconstruction. And the Reconstruction era was really trying to build back America after the Civil War, trying to get it on its feet because of the division between the North and the South. But when they started to implement the Jim Crow laws, which was separating Black Americans from white, there was a lot of violence. There was, of course, many things known as lynchings, and there were 2,800 victims of lynch mobs from 1882 to 1930 in 10 southern states. And out of those 2,800, 2,500 were Black. And this kind of sets like the racial dynamics and just the undertones, which then bled into the civil rights era, and which then bleeds into what we see now as far as Black Lives Matter, how all this history of civil unrest, of slavery, of different things have this inception because of all the different laws that were put in place that really were not in service to Black American life at the time. And that is where my mom's side of the family comes from. They were slaves in Texas and fled to the north up to South Carolina, which was still considered the South, and then made their way to Philadelphia. And in Philadelphia, that is a very historic city, a very historic town. And I know that the population of Philadelphia went from majority white to, I think, 50% of it. It was a 50% increase of Black Americans in Philadelphia. And there was a 150% increase of Black Americans in New York. And that, and just showing how that aspect of migration really influenced the economic value of those cities too. Because then once they start to see that there's more Black Americans fleeing to these northern cities, there was this apprehension of then taking care of these cities. There was this apprehension of making sure that these had good property value. You start to see more things of trying to deny Black Americans of their homes, trying to deny them of anything good so that they would now be forced to live in the ghetto, the parts of the cities that weren't taken care of. And some of them still reside there to this day. And one particular place in New York was Harlem, which is where then the Harlem Renaissance ended up coming up. And Harlem never really got the same effect of being like not taken care of as any of a lot of the other cities, because New York tends to have a different respect for the cities that they want to take care of, but Harlem is still considered a quote-unquote Black part of New York because of its impact and influence. And how that now all affects me today, I see, is I actually am, I wouldn't say I'm so far removed from that experience, but because of how the culture and the trauma that came from slavery, that came from the Reconstruction era, the sharecropping, there is a lot of not really wanting to talk about the history of what African American people have gone through. Though it is important, it is very hard for our elders to talk about it in a way without just outright denying that it even happened. And growing up, I knew that I did come from slave ancestry, and I knew that I did come from a background of people that were treated harshly and had this journey, but I didn't really understand exactly who it was that I am and what it is that I come from, because there is this cultural understanding that we all kind of come from the same place, but like when we don't really know it, you don't really know how to articulate it. And so I remember before my grandfather passed away in Louisiana, we were driving, and I believe it was either me or my father, we randomly asked him a question about our family. And this was a man that was in his 90s, and he was aging, and his body was falling before him. We had to help him up in a wheelchair, and he barely even spoke at this time. But for some reason, right then and right at that moment, he gave this entire life story of our family's history, and we couldn't even believe what we were hearing. We couldn't even ask any questions. We just let him speak for about an hour of our entire family's history, and I'll never forget that. Unfortunately, he did pass away in 2020 at the age of 96, so he did live a long, fruitful life. But it taught me a lesson about really reconnecting with the history and really understanding where it is that we come from, and really understanding what it is that our people went through so that we will have the story to tell in order to keep it alive, in order to have that cultural understanding of who it is that we are. And now I have a daughter who comes from this entire journey of generations of people that have fought, of people that have endured, and people that have overcome these different systems through migration because that they were looking for a better life in order for somebody like her to be on this planet. And that's really important to me, and that's all I have to say on my end. So I guess right now, if we have anybody in the audience that wants to ask any questions or anything that you all want to talk about, feel free. We'll open the floor for that. Yes.
I want to add something. Okay. So, good afternoon. I think that this is, first, thank you for sharing your story. I know that it's not easy to share personal stories, but I want to thank you and also for the time you dedicated on preparing this. I think that the reason this is very important now, in this moment of time in the United States, because once again, we are seeing, making references about migrants in a very dehumanized way. And again, they are being used as the scapegoats for the campaigns, right? So these stories are very important because people, when they think about migration, think about just people coming from other countries, but don't realize that this country, the fundament of this country is based on the stories that you are sharing, either by displacing Native Americans, by bringing Africans, and everything it was for economic reasons. To work here, Mexicans to work during the Bracero, the World War II for the Bracero program, and it was because in this economy, this labor force was important. And it was important also because it was, I mean, the labor conditions were not necessarily the best, or the wages, right? So, and I think that that's what is very important, these stories to share now, because when I hear you, I can see so many commonalities in your stories, right? One is the family separation, losing your history, losing your culture, and then having to pick up the pieces of who you are, right? And that's a very painful experience that many, many people live here in the United States. So I just wanted to add that, and thank you so much. I think that these stories are very important at this moment in time. Okay?
Is there anything that you all have wanted to add or contribute again? No, I think we're. Any other questions or comments? No? Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Yeah, definitely. I think they were not great working conditions and not livable wages, and they continue to not be still today. The proper working conditions is enough to read the paper to find out all the horrible stories about deaths that are caused because of the current working conditions, right? And the living wage definitely is out there too. What I wanted to add on my story was that so when my dad came, like I said, I don't want to come, but he would, what I know now to be the American dream, that's what he was trying to sell me to convince me to come. And when I got here, I was very disappointed because it's not what I imagined from what he was said. But I was disappointed when I arrived, and I think that I haven't asked him, and I will, but I think that he also himself eventually became disappointed of this American dream because he did retire a couple of years ago, and he went back home because to our hometown because he knew that, again, those living wages are not enough. He worked in the fields. He didn't have money saved to be able to retire and stay here in this country. He didn't have the health care anymore, and he realized that there was nothing. Once he contributed all his energy and efforts to the agricultural industry in California, once he retired, there was nothing for him. And so he went back home. And when we talk over the phone, he tells me of how happy he is there. And so I think that he himself also became and realized that that dream that many people think happens here is not real. It's just an interest of certain groups for people to believe that so that they come. The other thing I wanted to share is that right after we arrived in the United States, 9/11 happened. And that caused the borders to be now extremely secure, right? By adding more Border Patrol agents, by adding more technology, by adding more, and again, that narrative of the immigrants coming to steal jobs and to harm the U.S. continues since then. And what that has led to is that many of our community members, including my brother that I share about, were not able to migrate back to our hometown. So when my brother left and came here, he was not able to go back until he got his green card recently. But that exacerbated the family separation because I told you my dad was able to go and come back. And yes, it was our family separated, but we were able to see each other, once a year, twice a year. But now there's families who haven't been able to see each other for decades. And so that has caused for many families to now build community here and in the Central Valley and Madera and Fresno and all over. And so I just wanted to also share that I recently made a trip to the border, and I realized that we keep talking about, the immigrants, but that we need to take a look at the humanity and in people and the reasons why people are migrating, right? Mirna said earlier about the economy and how this economy is based on cheap labor. And So one of the things I realized is that, people who are stuck in the border is because of that reason, because they are poor, that they can't afford to get a visa, that they can't afford to start a business in the United States and come the right way, as they say. But also, I invite others that when they talk about immigration and they say, like, why don't you come the right way, that they do some research and find out what is the right way means, and realize that people like my brother had to wait over 20 years to do it the right way.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. I think one of the big things I usually get asked is like, what is the solution to all of this? We're talking so much, at least for the problems that face indigenous people, and I think one of the biggest things is acknowledgement, but when it comes to acknowledgement is only the first step. A lot of people think they can do that first step and then it's done. We've fixed everything. There's still a lot of problems, and one of the biggest things that needs to be done in this country is the acknowledgement of the history that had occurred in the last 500 years for indigenous peoples. It's like, even now, it's like people don't really want to call what happened to my people as a genocide. They're very scared of that word and to acknowledge that. And when looking at genocide, one of the main factors is causing bodily harm within a group, separating like children from their parents. And that happened with the boarding school system that was started in like the early 1800s to assimilate Native American people into Christianity. And so, their hair was cut, they faced physical abuses, sexual abuses, they weren't allowed to speak their language. So because of not being able to engage that, a lot of that was also lost over time. And then there's also preventing births within a group. And even in the 60s and 70s, like a lot of the health clinics that Native people were using, there's a lot of Native women who went for basic procedures and came out sterilized. And so it's difficult to hear that, and they say over 25% of Native women were sterilized, and that's why today we have that trauma of going to the doctors or trusting like certain like hospitals because of what had been done to us. And so if you go to like the college I'm going to now, Fresno State, they have a genocide memorial and they have like a list of all the genocides that have occurred. But if you look at like in the Americas and Mexico, it's blank. And it's just kind of like an insult to me because it's like my struggle is being unacknowledged at that point, and there's clear evidence throughout history. It's just that a lot of people are uncomfortable to talk about, which to me, I find ridiculous, because if history makes you comfortable, then it's not real history. History's supposed to be uncomfortable. It's supposed to make you question things. It's supposed to make you feel a certain way. And even with my 8th grade grandmother, Angelique Hassani, who was a translator for her tribe in the Spanish and the French, when as like she got older and she had her children were sold off to older men. They were sold off when they were 12 years old because Catholic common law at that time was 12, and they were sold off to older men. And so it's also acknowledging generational trauma and what generational trauma like really is. People think, well, that happened so long ago, that's not going to affect me anymore, but it's not true. It's like that pain is transferred down, and I'm not even talking about like in a spiritual sense. I'm talking about if your family has like gotten so much trauma, it's like the trauma transforms like over time, and as it goes down the line, it'll eventually just like hit you because of like the pain that your parents like still hold on to. So it's a very like scientific like study, and you can look at it from that way, and you can look at it from a spiritual way as well, but it's a real thing. And acknowledging the history, engaging with it, and teaching people about it and being open about it is one way to heal it and stop that process from continuing. Because even the history now, it's like my tribe is barely still like trying to like get out of hiding, and they only came out of hiding in the early 2000s with the state recognition in 2017, and they're trying to show everybody that we are still here, we exist, because there's people that think that we're extinct. Especially the most education I got about Native people before I reconnected when I was in elementary is they told us about the California mission system, but they didn't really mention like what was done to get those things built. They simply said, oh, these Native people went to the missions and then they weren't allowed to leave. And then turn the next page, and that was like the short and the end of it. Like, we didn't really hear anything. And they took us to these missions as field trips, and we were walking and not knowing what occurred there. It was more like a fun field trip kind of thing that wasn't really like a big deal. And so it's like we're still not getting that acknowledgement within the school system. And I do have like some hope, as in Visalia, they're gonna start making ethnic studies a required course in school, but I think that's something that really needs to be done nationwide, because You know, it's like we're still facing it today. A lot of like reservations live in poverty because of the forced state of dependency that the government forced onto people. It's like when they moved us to reservations, they were prisoners of war camps. And so we weren't allowed to hunt for our own food anymore. We weren't allowed to provide for ourselves anymore. We had to rely off packages from the government. And mostly it came from flour and lard that often had, you know, bugs in it, or it was expired. And that's how fry bread was created, because they were trying to make something out of a worse situation in order to feed themselves. So it's like there's like so much history that isn't really talked about, and a lot of people don't really have common knowledge. And so that's why it meant so much to me when my tribe finally did outside registration. I did apply for registration, and I finally got my tribal ID. And even though an ID doesn't define how Native I am, it is an important testament, because a lot of people didn't believe me when I said I was Native. They're like, no, there's no way. How come, like, how is that even possible? It's like that idea of like that we're not around anymore, and someone saying like, oh, I'm reconnecting, that's immediately met with suspicion. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I'm in total agreement with both of you, especially just thinking about the current attack on this kind of education. I know Florida has been trying to ban African American studies. I believe it's either New Mexico or Arizona, one of the states, but it has also been in trying to ban African American studies. And there's been so many different states that are now, it's on the table to go ahead and start saying, yeah, we don't want to even acknowledge that slavery even happened in this country, because it makes our students too uncomfortable, which is, it's a shame, and it's an annoying shame that that's going on. And just to even like think about like the attack as far as things such as, affirmative action, that has been really detrimental to having people like myself even like being able to get to a higher level of education. And we start to see that there has been a deliberate attack on people like us, that have been affected by these systems that are in place that, like we say, displaces our communities, separates families, and just builds up this trauma. And it almost feels as if we've been gaslit to believe that these things have not happened. And it's just a tactic that is very frustrating. Sorry for my mini rant, but I had to go on the rant about that. I have a picture right here. I had actually taken this when I went to Philadelphia. You can't really see it, but it's a picture right here of my great-great-great-grandmother, who was born a slave. And it kind of put in perspective of how it's not that the excuse of, oh, it wasn't that long ago. And this is an actual like picture, like portrait, not painted, but using a camera to show somebody that is born into slavery. And it kind of put things into perspective for me of just how, though like it doesn't matter how many generations far back it is, that these things are still like that, like the history is not necessary. It's not, when we think of history, we think of things that are far back. When we think of history, when we think of ancestors, we think of things that are so far before us that we can't really like have anything tangible to it. And so I know, for at least with the African American experience, that has been something that has been a very big struggle in grappling and dealing with. But to kind of have examples that are here that are tangible, but we have a country that has been so active in like denying that it even happened, has made it all the more frustrating. And it's just, yeah, it just gets frustrating. Any other questions or comments from anybody at all? Yes.
Hi, my name's Catalina Lair. I am Shane's wife. So I go on a lot of his adventures with him, including this one. So right now I'm a student at UC Merced, and I'm currently majoring in ethnic studies, critical race ethnic studies. So I've been doing a lot of my coursework on African studies, migration, Chicano studies, American Indian studies, and stuff like that. And so this semester has been more impactful than the rest of my years in my academic career, just because I was able to learn more about African studies and more about Chicano studies and stuff. And so my career goal before the semester was to become an academic advisor for incoming students to help support them during their academic journey. But learning all of this history and all of this culture and like what struggles these people go on a daily basis was really eye-opening for me this semester. So I have now changed my career to become a policymaker in education specifically. Just because, thank you. Just because I see like a huge need for these programs to continue getting the support and stuff. And so, for example, I went to Clovis West here in Fresno, which is kind of right up the road from this church. So they have a lot of white people on the academic board. And so a lot of programs like SOAR that I was a part of didn't really get a lot of funding and stuff and a lot of recognition for a lot of the Chicano students, a lot of the American Indian students and stuff like that. And so I just see that there's just this huge need for this academic policy to be changed and to be updated to help the incoming students. Because at UC Merced, over half, like 62% of the students there are Chicano people, they're Hispanic, they're Mexican people. And you don't really see that anywhere else except for the Central Valley. And I feel like there's just a huge need just for these policies to be put in place into other school systems, just where the need is like needed. So I feel like all of these stories and stuff that I'm hearing is all very inspirational, and it just makes me want to pursue my education even further and even harder. And I might not be procrastinating next semester, I don't know though. I kind of have ADHD, so it kind of like distracts me, but it's just, I think it's important to learn about not only your own history, but other people's histories, because the interconnectedness between so many different cultures and so many different people across not only the nation, but across the world is crazy, because we hear about the things going on in Gaza right now, and a lot of the minority communities are really impacted by that as well, because we have a lot of Arab people here that live in the Central Valley. I know a lot of Arab people myself that are currently protesting and stuff on the daily in Visalia, where I currently live with my husband. So I think it's just important that you reconnect with your culture, and even if you are not reconnecting and you were born and raised in the culture, like learn more about like other different cultures. I think that's just important to realize that like how interconnected everybody is like the big thing of like resistance against like the majority. And so there's a lot more minorities than there is the majorities. So I think that as long as we continue to band together and we continue to read our stories and tell our stories, we will make a difference. And I believe that one day our children, the next 7 generations, as Native Americans always like to say, they will benefit from these protests and these activism stuff that's going on right now. So thanks.
Thank you for that. That was a great comment and really encapsulates what this Platica was attempting to accomplish, was the intersection with all of our stories and the intersection with all of our experiences, our familial experiences, ancestral experiences that really tie in together what it is that we are collectively facing and what it is that we do need to resist, as Catalina put it together, how resistance really is the way of survival. And through that, that means that we have to have more events like this roundtable discussions, anything that is solves, anything that provides healing, anything that provides enlightenment, anything that provides education, anything that provides any sense of understanding between different ethnic groups, different racial groups, and different genders. Everything that is cross-cultural, I believe, is the key for us to continue to move forward and to face these oppressive systems. Is there anybody else that would like to contribute to the conversation? Yeah. Good. All right. Well, if there's nothing else, then I guess that we would just want to say thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Yes, and everybody have a great rest of your day. Thank you.